Welcome to a Mackenzie Institute Long Talk.
That trip you're taking to South America sounds exciting, but who will you turn to if you get kidnapped? If a plane crashes overseas and you think you have a loved one on board, who do you call? Hello, my name is Alan Bonner, and I'm in the business of risk, crisis, and disaster management. This is another in our series of interviews with people who have lived through or managed an event of the kind you might face. I'd like you to meet Gar Pardy, a career diplomat with almost 3 decades of experience in crisis management. As a Canadian ambassador in Central America, he's handled everything from lost passports to Canadian travelers jailed on drug charges. Now based in Ottawa for the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, Gar is the point man for helping Canadians and their families after earthquakes, fires, plane crashes, and coups d'etat. We begin our conversation by talking about hostage situations. I asked Gar what to do first.
First thing you do is, the usual thing in any sort of a situation such as this. You could try to come up with as much of the factual, if you like, the biographical, the environmental, all of that kind of information. Who they are, where they are, what happened, who are the key people that may be involved in this, both in terms of on the criminal side or even on the management side, because as you know, all of our situations occur in foreign countries. And so, we don't pick up and dial 911. It doesn't work for us that way. We need and usually most cases, managing these crises from a point in Ottawa is that you're dealing with our embassies and our consulates and our offices overseas. So we're going through intermediaries. That's really the first point. Then you mobilize your own people here at Ottawa that you need, and then make the kind of the call-outs that have to be done. Though that's the practical measures. In a management sense, the very first thing you do is to try to slow the action down. There is a tendency when crisis is happening, a person is kidnapped or a plane is hijacked, there is a natural tendency for people to speed things up. And that is the last thing in the world that you want to do when you're managing a crisis. You slow it down. And the leader of that crisis, that is one of their main functions, is to provide the tempo at which one deals with a crisis.
When you're dealing cross-cultural and cross-international political boundaries, different response agencies, police forces, etc., this must add a three-dimensional level of complexity.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where you need to have a fair bit of experience yourself. I come from a pretty diverse background myself. I've been just lived in all parts of the world, and I've come to deal with people and have a fair understanding. And the fact that we deal with embassies and our own offices overseas, and our people on the ground there, where they, as part of their day-to-day job, they get to know the police, the health authorities or the security authorities, people of that nature, and then in effect can help guide us in terms of how we manage a crisis.
It's not too hard, I don't assume, to coordinate when different languages are involved. You put your hands on someone who speaks that other language. But what about the culture, and what about the law, and what about those other diverse elements? How do you coordinate?
On the law side, of course, if you get into something, I think you mentioned at the beginning what we're talking about is kidnapping or hostage taking. And every country has a variety of laws that apply in this. You take a country like Colombia, where kidnappings are endemic, and you're talking several thousands a year. The structure to deal with kidnappings in Colombia is quite different than it would be, say, even in Canada or the UK, where in effect it's much less of a criminal problem. And in Colombia, you need to know what the laws are, because in effect you want to stay inside the laws when you deal with and respond to these kinds of crises, because once you go outside of the law, then you lose the cooperation of the local authorities. So understanding that law is very important. Culturally, language, those are things that you take in your stride. Most cases where a crisis involves, the possibility of a loss of life, culture doesn't become that important. That becomes the guiding element. That becomes the focus. And while you have to be sensitive to variations out there, I think that tends to sharpen the attention of everybody involved.
When you're trying to manage something so far away, through another language or culture, across a border, how do you know who knows what he's doing or she's doing? How do you know who to trust? Who's credible?
You don't, in any absolute sense. You learn by the by the precedents that are there, if you like. And we have a lot of these things that go on, day after day, week after week. And after a while, there is a sixth sense. Even talking to somebody over the telephone, you can get a sense of where they're coming from, what their bona fides are, and whether or not they're on the same wavelength or moving towards the same objective that you have in all of this. And so all of these things come together. And of course, again, you come back and you use the embassy. These are people, we make sure that our embassy people abroad have a range of contacts. They know the right police officials. They know the right people in the interior ministry in that particular government. And in some instances, like we're in Colombia, where if you've got a kidnapping, you've got to go out into the local community. Normally we would seek an intermediary in Colombia. We've used the church, where in effect we go to the local archbishop and say, look, we've got a Canadian kidnapped now. Do you have a padre? Do you have a father in a local parish that we can go to, and use him as the intermediary in order to talk to the FARC or the ELN out there? And that works. And and the fact that it is a church, it is a structure. You can place a high degree of trust with those people.
What sort of human qualities and capabilities are you looking for in a fellow crisis manager whom you've never met and are only dealing with on the phone?
What you're looking for more often than not is quick thinking, and in a sense, an ability to assimilate and to digest and a vast amount of information in a given period of time, and an ability to see things in wholes. You don't want people that are particularly particularistic in their approach to things. That they're going to hive down a side road on you. You want to be able to people that brings all of this together. And in basketball terms, you say they've got to have good hands. They've got to know how to handle that ball, and that's what you're looking for here in these kinds of people. It's somebody that's well-rounded, somebody that is not distracted by the ephemeral, and somebody that's not overcome by a disaster that occurs, because quite often you do get mini disasters within a larger disasters, and you want people to basically to be able to pick themselves up and get on with it, realizing that there is a
unpredictability of disaster and crisis. What sort of training or preparation is logical?
Experience, I would come back to. You give, is probably the best thing that a person can have, that you've got somebody that has gone through this before. In terms of specific skills, an ability to talk to people, to be able to empathize, to be able to direct people in that sense of getting people to do what you want done, because you're the director of all of this. You're the ones that you have the big picture here. You're the ones that want a number of people going in a common direction, and your ability to get them to do that, do it willingly, and get on with it, work long hours, work in very adverse conditions in many instances. That's the kind of skills that you want in your manager. It's any good manager, in that larger sense, is a good manager for crises by and large.
In hostage takings, any other advice or any other recollections from those experiences?
Oh, yeah. Lima, Peru, which went on for months. Patience that you need, certainly in all of this. And again, your ability to manage a variety of audiences out there, because you get into a hostage, you have to manage the family. And I'm not using manage in any negative sense here. I'm using it being able to keep the family with you, that they have confidence that you know what you are doing, and that that the end of the process is going to be a good one for them. Being able to do that with families, being able to do that with other parts of your own political system, being able to do that with foreign governments, because in many instances other foreigners are involved, and other governments who do not have, in many instances, the kind of sophisticated system that we do. They come to us, and you want to talk to them about all of this. Your ability to mobilize resources within your own government, because this can be expensive, managing a crisis that goes on for many months and that sort of thing. So all of these kinds of skills are there.
But now you don't know the end result of this process you're in. So what can you do to reassure families?
There's a fair bit of ego involved in all of this. I never go into a crisis believing that we're going to have a disaster at the end of it. And a crisis that you can come in after a plane crash, the disaster is there, so a different set of skills. But I'm talking about a crisis management here that is ongoing, and you're talking a kidnapping, a hostage taking, or even a set of negotiations with regards to a bombing or something of that nature, where there is a dynamic attached to what you're managing here. And I think in that kind of a situation is where you've got to have a fair amount of faith in yourself that, boy, you're going to have this thing through your skills and through your ability to mobilize other people, you're going to have a good result here. But if you go in believing that that this is not going to work out for you, it's probably not going to work out for you.
Are you in danger of raising false expectations and hopes, though?
Oh, yes. I think that danger is always there. You've got to be very careful. But again, let me put it this way. My experience, we've not lost anybody. We've got a good track record in all of the crises, and I've been dealing with crises. I'm trying to think of the first one that I was ever involved in, probably back in 68 or 69, and we've never lost anybody. That's not a bad, not saying that tomorrow that's not going to change, but we've had a good record. And so I bring, probably some would argue that there's a bit of hubris there or overconfidence, but no. I go into these crises with the firm belief that through the skills and the talents and the experience of a variety of people in our system, we're going to have a good result. And while you're right, you got to be careful in dealing with families that you not, in effect, overcompensate, if you mean for their fears and that sort of thing.
Let's talk about evacuations. Moving large numbers of people. You must have done this dozens of times.
Yeah. That was just last year, too.
The logistical nightmare. How do you do it?
Information is the key thing. Communications are the two, I guess, key elements in all of this. You've got to know who they are, where they are, and what family structures are, what the degree of danger that they are in a given thing, and then being able to communicate to them in a finite sense, being able to say to them, look, you be at such and such a location, you have this material with you or supplies with you, and we're going to have transport there, and we're going to get you out to X, whether it's an airport or it's an exit point outside of the country. That kind of thing, you've got to have those facilities there. If you don't know who they are and you can't communicate with them, you can't evacuate. It's as simple as that. So when you start with those premises, we have tried to build a system, so that in effect those two ingredients are there before you have a crisis. We collect information voluntarily from Canadians all over the world who live for particular periods of time in given countries. And so we've got hundreds of thousands of Canadians. I can go into my office and point a button and I'll get 3,000 names of Canadians living all over Indonesia, for example. I can organize that data as to where they are geographically, who they are, what their family structure is. Contact information is there both for them in Indonesia and for the next of family and relatives here in Canada. So all of that information is there.
I'm trying to translate this experience into the private sector, and I'm thinking you need to have an exit strategy before you go there.
Yep.
You need to have arrangements with other companies, other organizations.
If you're not large enough yourself to come with your own infrastructure for all of this, which is what we tell. We work very closely with Canadian companies in this, whether they're going into the Sudan or into Algeria or Yemen or Colombia. They all come in and we talk to them. We give them, our experience, and basically our role is to tell them, look, we would like that, you have as much support as possible here, but at the end of the day, we are there for you as well. But many companies now are starting to realize that it's easier for them to have their own, if you want, exit strategy, but not only the strategy, but have the services that are necessary to make that strategy work.
Kind of like looking for the exit sign in a theater before you go in?
Absolutely just it, yep.
And if you're in a foreign country, how do you spell exit in that language?
In that language, and I think as well, and it depends. But if a lot of the Canadian companies, of course, are resource extraction people or resource location companies oil and natural gas companies, minerals, that sort of thing, they're going to be in some pretty what they refer to as frontier conditions here. And the Sudan, where there's a civil war going on, the points of the line of contention moves back and forth. The Canadian company is in the middle of all of this. Well, it makes bloody good sense before you send in 200 Canadians from Alberta that you've got all of the services that are necessary there. Algeria, you pick up the newspapers, and companies are starting to realize that it's cheaper to do it in advance than it is to scramble after the fact and you've got a crisis on your hands. Yeah.
Any other advice for people traveling either on vacation or on business abroad?
Have a valid Canadian passport. Nothing more complicated than that. Buy medical insurance and make sure that you got the address of the nearest Canadian mission. You do that kind of thing, and it's amazing the number of Canadians out there that don't have medical insurance. Not having medical insurance, and you're talking tens of thousands of dollars if you have a problem. And a lot of Canadians have problems. And it's amazing the number of Canadians leave Canada, not a valid passport. We had one case. It was, as a matter of fact, the guy on his way to Saudi Arabia, an oil worker from Alberta, he picked up his wife's passport, and he was heavily bearded, the whole works, got on the plane in Calgary, got all the way to Saudi Arabia with that passport. This is his wife's passport. The Saudis picked him up, wouldn't let him in. They kicked him back to London, with his wife's passport. But it's something that could happen to anybody. At least look at your damn passport before you leave the country.
You've been an ambassador. You've been awakened in the middle of the night with phone calls telling you that there's a war going on in the neighboring country. How do you handle that sort of rapidly escalating, evolving situation?
Creative. Again, you reach out for information. But in order to be able to reach out for information, you've done a lot of planning. Everywhere you go around the world, there's always the possibility that something is going to go bang in the night on you. And in our lives and the kind of work that we have to do, you plan for that. You assume that's the norm. And so you're not surprised when something goes bang in the night. You know who to call at 3 a.m. in the morning, whether it's other news reports where they can give you an update. Because news organizations, we can't compete with news organizations in terms of information. It's as simple as that. And I don't think anybody can. CP, Reuters, AP, CNN now, all of those places, they are repositories of vast amounts of information, and it's all accessible to everybody. And so you go after that information so that you get a picture, you have an understanding of what's going on, so that you have then an ability then to crystallize that in terms of what your responsibilities are, which is to provide, information and services for the Canadian public so that they are not put in harm's way. And at the same time then to provide information to your government so that we can do the appropriate political reaction that may be necessary.
So you're not mad at the press for knowing more than you do?
Not at all. I make it a point everywhere where I am around the world, it's the best contacts to have. And I have never had a bad experience in my life.
Gar Pardy was a Canadian ambassador to Costa Rica when American forces went into Panama to capture the dictator Manuel Noriega. The first he heard of it was a phone call in the middle of the night, a call from Canadian press.
December 22nd, I guess it was, and they sent in the airborne, and I get a call from CP, the desk, about 2 a.m. in the morning in Toronto saying, what do you know? And I didn't know anything at that point in Costa Rica because more information was available back in, certainly in Canada than we would have had in Costa Rica. So the guy on the desk was an old person I had dealt with over the years, and I said, well, let me know what's going on here. And so he gave me a whole bunch of stuff, and he even faxed down a whole bunch of material that had come in from them, largely American material, of course. And I had the whole raft at 2 a.m. in the morning reading all of this. The next call I get is Mr. Joe Clark, who was the foreign minister at the time. And Mr. Clark says, Gar, what's going on down there? Well, I had just been briefed by CP, and I had everything. He had nothing back here because it was the middle of the night. The Prime Minister was calling saying, well, what are we going to do about all of this? Since the Americans are involved, we're going to, it's the first time we show up in the morning, somebody's going to need a reaction to all of this. So I was able to brief Mr. Clark and everything that was available and everything else. And he says, fine, can you draft a statement for our use that when I can give to the Prime Minister and we can use it early in the morning when the press comes at us? And drafted the statement, faxed it back up. End of the matter. But this is using the resources that are out there, and the press. As I say, you can't go. They may muck things up in a detail here or there, but by and large, when you deal with a lot of information which they have available to them, you can get a pretty damn good picture. And on top of that, the other good thing about then, by that time, we had what we call an honorary consul down in Panama City, and the lines were still working. I got her on the telephone, and her house was right on the bay that the American helicopters were coming in over, and so she was sitting on her balcony watching the Americans come in, and the B-117s that were taking out some of the military bases and one thing and another, and so we were getting almost recording their conversations. You were getting all the sounds in the background. So very quickly we had a pretty good idea of what was going on the ground in Panama, coming from our own sources, and the government could then react accordingly.
So Canada's foreign minister thinks Gar Pardy's a hero because he can be awakened at 3 o'clock in the morning. He knows exactly what's going on.
But that's true for anybody in our service that are doing the job out there. This is not unique to us.
But did you confess to your boss?
Well, I told Mr. Clark about this, yes, and and from his perspective, this is what he wants. When he calls up, he wants somebody to be able to tell him, and it doesn't matter whether I'm in Costa Rica dealing with Panama or I'm sitting in Ottawa. And that's the very first thing that you have to do in managing crises. Somebody at the center has got to be there. It's got to bring all of this information together, synthesize it, make some sense out of it.
Now, you probably deserve an honorary degree in comparative religions or something after dealing with so many different cultural and religious instances. Give me an example of some of the difficulties you deal with. I guess, for example, where there's a train wreck or a plane crash, in some religions and cultures you have to retrieve every minute body part, keep them separate from others, and so on.
Yeah, burial traditions, obsequiaries, as we call it, is what the technical term is here. They vary from religion to religion, from culture to culture. If you're a Jew, and you, strictly speaking, you should be buried before sundown on the day that you die. Muslims sometimes in the same sort of thing, but if you're Jewish and you just died way up in northeastern Vietnam and your family wants you back before sundown in Montreal, it ain't going to work. And so, we talk with the rabbi, say, back here, who then say, yeah, okay, and he'll talk to the family because the families sometimes don't understand some of these limitations. They don't, they see it, that it can happen. And again, information is very important, understanding what it is before you blunder. And saying, when you talk to the family, say, no, we understand, we know exactly what you're feeling here, and it would be very nice if we were able to get the remains back before sundown, but that's not possible. We've talked to the rabbi, and he's quite understanding of all of this. And those things, you put it into play and you use it. And by and large, people are not unreasonable. The grief factor is an important one here. But then you do reach out for allies in that. We will, in terms of, say, calling a family in Canada when a relative or family member has died overseas, we will, in the first instance, always have we call the RCMP here, and then the RCMP will be in touch with the police, the local police jurisdiction, and they will always send a person to the address and do it in person. Because there's one thing you should never do over the telephone is to call somebody up and say, look, somebody, because one, you don't know the closeness of the relationship and what the meaning, what this would be.
Or these days, if they're on a cell phone on the highway and they drive off.
And they drive off, yeah, exactly. And we've had cases where we've tried to stay ahead of the media in terms of names being released because we have no control. Usually in Canada, the press themselves are very reasonable and very responsible. But in many parts of the world, we had a helicopter that crashed in eastern Russia, a couple of years ago, and we didn't, and the next of kin there, she was away from the residential address, and we didn't get to her with the news in a private sense before.
What do victims normally want from you?
What they're looking for very much is information. They want to know what happened in some way or the other in all of this. They want to know that they are being talked to by people who know what they're talking about. And so, and it doesn't matter what the crisis is. And we tell them, and from us as a government, there's a higher expectation is that we can do something about it. And the real frustration is that in many of these situations, it is that we can't do anything in the absolute sense. I.e., if there's a hostage taken in Lima, Peru, the authorities in Lima, Peru are the ones that are going to deal with it. We can try to help them but it's help at the margins. But if they're going to decide that they're going to send in a SWAT team, that's their decision. We try to get at them and say, no, look, in these kinds of situations, it's most important that the lives of the hostages is first and foremost. The fact that you've got a political crisis in your country in which this hostage taking is a manifestation, that is secondary, and trying to get those kinds of things. But for Canadians, they kind of feel that we've got a magic wand, a Canadian magic wand that we can wave over any situation in any part of the world and we can make it come out right. And that's the biggest frustration we have.
What are your observations about post-traumatic stress disorder?
I haven't seen it in any finite sense. We had a couple of kidnappings in Central Africa, around the lakes down there. We had one woman, middle-aged teacher, was kidnapped along with 3 other foreigners, kept for a week in very arduous conditions. She was released. We have not seen the other 3 foreigners, which was 2 Swiss and a New Zealander. And we got her back and debriefed her and everything else. And in her case, which is probably about as an arduous set of conditions that you can have any individual go through, was a magnificent reaction on her part. And she would call us after, because we were the only ones that really knew what she had gone through and the conditions and everything else. And so we became sort of a point of contact for her. Even to this day, she will call us. And it's not so that there is a post-traumatic stress thing that she's dealing with. I think she's looking for some understanding of why she survived and the other 3 people didn't. We had another one where 14 tourists were captured in one of the parks there in southern Uganda. 8 of them were killed. 6 were released, including the one Canadian was there. And what they're looking for in all of this is these people, and I guess in the first instance I would say these are very strong people themselves, the kind of work that they're doing and this sort of thing, and in their own minds they can come to certain conclusions about what they've just gone through. But more often than not is what they come back to us seeking is some understanding again. Why me? That I'm back in Calgary, I'm alive, I'm well, and yet people that I knew and loved, they're dead in a jungle in southern Uganda. It's that kind of, and that's what they come and asked us for. I've not seen, and maybe we wouldn't, because if somebody has a serious post-traumatic, something like that, they would probably end up with professionals within their own community, and we wouldn't necessarily see it.
You've had the task of arranging for memorials and trips to the site. What purpose do these serve, and how do the victims, the family members, react to that, and how do they drive that process?
Oh, extremely important. The largest one, of course, the largest event in Canadian history was the Air India, when it dropped, blew up just west of Ireland, June 22nd, 23rd, 1985, and in one way or another I've been involved with that ever since. 329 people, vast majority of them were Canadians on that. Husbands, wives, children, everybody. And an event of that magnitude, creates, I think, within our system, a whole variety of issues, because the aircraft took off from Canada, and clearly Canadians were involved in putting the bomb on that aircraft thing. Canadian security at airports were drawn into question as how did you get a bomb on an aircraft at a time when the barriers were pretty high, all of these kinds of things, and so it triggered a whole series of events within the Canadian government. But our responsibility was to get people on the ground in Ireland.
For thousands of years we've been preoccupied with what the moment of death means. Does the soul leave the body or what? And John Donne said in 1612, as virtuous men pass mildly away and whisper to their souls to go, whilst some of their sad friends do say the breath goes now, and some say no.
Yeah.
He was and a cleric himself. He was examining what does the moment of death mean
to, and for the survivor, what is left behind in that sense. No, but again, these are large thoughts, large ideas. And as I said, I can understand why people do it, and what I do is to make sure that they can do it, and do it without having the normal encumbrances. I mean, if you've got 200 or 300 people descending on southwestern Ireland in June, in Cork, out of Cork, and all of them wanting to get out to the nearest point of land, and the crash site was about 180 kilometers offshore. Dunmanus Bay was the place in Ireland which was the nearest point of land. So you get people on the ground, you get people there, you talk to them, making sure that, and of course, when you get in a tragedy of that magnitude, of course, the remains, the bodies, come ashore. You need identification. And there, I think we recovered only 176 bodies. And the recovery of a body in those kinds, in almost any kind of circumstances around the world, is one of the most important things to families, that you have to get those remains. And when you can't do that, you've got a major problem on your hands.
What do you think of the people that I disrespectfully refer to as people in the head industry, psychologists, psychiatrists, who show up at a school shooting and say something like, "Let the healing begin"? It sounds like it's out of a Rod McEwen song or something.
It is, and it's so programmed, it is so artificial, and the value of this, as you know, is under serious study and scrutiny, and a lot of serious people in the industries, I shouldn't say industry, that's... but
the head industry.
The head industry. You mean serious people there, and you look at them, they say that, look, there is no evidence whatsoever that there is any value to any of this. I think the key thing, and when you get something like this, is other family, other friends being around people, talking to them. For a stranger to come in and in a few moments to talk to somebody that maybe it could be a child 8 or 9 years old, or it could be a parent, and you can do something that's going to make a difference, I have great doubt about that, serious doubts about it.
Are there other lessons that you would extract from those and share with us?
Don't plan too much. And maybe it's peculiar to our business. I've got a world out there that I deal with. Every country in the world, there isn't a piece of sand out there that you can't find a Canadian perched on. So my requirements in terms of planning is more by way of having the facilities there, having people that I know and trust available to me, knowing that we've got a set of offices out there and that sort of thing. So I don't sort of finitely plan that in Japan I'm going to have to deal with an earthquake. I probably am going to have to deal with an earthquake, but I leave it loose in Japan. It could be something else is going to happen there. It could be a bad fire in downtown Tokyo at a hotel where you've got 100 Canadian tourists staying. Things like that. So we tend to stay very loose in terms of sort of pushing our planning out to specific kinds of incidents and events and that. But
you keep your capability tight
you
of
keep
evacuations.
Absolutely, all of those kinds of things. And in all of this, it's expensive, and you've got to realize if you go into a crisis and believing that you're not going to spend any money, then, well, forget about it. It ain't going to work. And fortunately, Canadians still agree to pay taxes, and so we've got good support.
Well, thank you, and given the business you're in, I hope not to hear from you.
And I hope that I never hear from you either, in a crisis situation.
Canadian diplomat Gar Pardy, who is with the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade in Ottawa.
Any views expressed here are not necessarily those of the Mackenzie Institute, its speakers, sponsors, or supporters, but the Institute is dedicated to fostering public discussion, debate, and education about security matters. Google the Mackenzie Institute to join the discussion. The Mackenzie Institute is grateful to its sponsors and supporters. Some of our short pods and long talks are a result of the support of Heathbridge Capital Management Limited, the National Post, and Dundurn Publishing.